The ledger was discovered in 1891, hidden beneath a rotting floorboard in what had once been the master's house. Time had warped the wood above it and termites had eaten away at the edges, but the book itself survived. Its leather cover was cracked and dry. The pages smelled of dust and age. Most entries were ordinary. Numbers. Names. Transactions that reflected the daily machinery of slavery. But one section was different. The handwriting shifted. The ink darkened. The spacing grew uneven, as if the person writing had begun to hesitate. The words were still precise, but something human had entered the record. Fear, perhaps. Or uncertainty. And then there was a list that did not match the rest. 12 names. All children. They were written without explanation, without price, without the usual marks that accompany the sale. Just names, ages, and a date. Christmas Day. For decades, no one understood what that list meant. The plantation itself sat along the Mississippi, where the river bent wide and slow. Sugarcane fields stretched outward in rigid lines, demanding speed and punishment from those forced to work them. Unlike cotton, sugar allowed no delay. Every moment mattered. Every body was pushed to its limit. The man who owned the plantation was not unusual for his time. He was educated, meticulous, and deeply invested in the idea of control. He kept records of everything. Crops. Weather. Illness. Births. Deaths. He believed order was proof of authority. Children were part of that order. They were born into it, raised inside it, and trained early to understand their place. Most did not know another life existed. Some learned quickly. Others learned through pain. The 12 children listed in the ledger ranged in age from 6 to 14. They worked in different sections of the plantation. Some in the fields. Some near the house. A few were assigned lighter tasks because of their size. None of them were considered valuable on their own. Not yet. That would change. According to scattered correspondence found years later, the plantation was facing financial pressure. Sugar prices had fallen. Equipment needed repair. Debts were growing. The master needed liquidity, and quickly. Selling adult laborers risked disrupting production. Selling children was easier. Their absence could be absorbed. Their loss could be explained. But Christmas was an unusual choice. On that morning, the children were told to wash and dress more carefully than usual. No one explained why. Adults avoided their eyes. The overseer gave instructions without detail. Wagons were prepared near the road, their wheels already packed with mud. Some of the children thought they were being moved to another part of the plantation. Others believed they were in trouble. One of the youngest began to cry, and was told sharply to stop. By midday, the wagons were gone. No record exists of where the children were taken. No bill of sale has ever been found. No buyer named. Only the ledger entry, and the sudden absence noted weeks later in the plantation's labor logs. What followed was silence. For months, no mention appeared in official records. Work continued. Crops were harvested. The riverboats came and went. Life on the plantation adjusted, as it always did. Children disappeared before. Adults disappeared too. That was not unusual. What was unusual was what happened next. In the spring, rumors began to circulate among nearby plantations. Whispers passed between workers at river landings and church gatherings. Stories that did not align. Accounts that contradicted official explanations. Someone claimed the children had never left the area. Someone else said they had been hidden. At first, the rumors were dismissed. Then they grew more specific. A wounded man had been seen near the property months earlier. A runaway. Injured. Barely able to walk. According to one account, a child had found him and made a decision that no adult would have dared to make. The idea seemed impossible. Children were watched closely. They were not trusted with secrets. And yet, as time passed, the rumors refused to fade. 9 months went by with no resolution, no discovery, no proof. 9 months of silence. Inside the plantation house, the master's records remained precise. No disruptions were noted. No disturbances recorded. But the ledger, the same one that had listed the children, contained small changes. Margins filled with brief notes. Corrections written over previous entries. Dates adjusted. Someone was paying attention. When discovery finally came, it was not dramatic. There was no chase. No confrontation. Just a door opened where no one expected one to exist. A space that should have been empty, but was not. What was found there would follow the plantation long after the sugar fields were gone. And it would raise a question history rarely asks. Not what happened to the children. But how long the truth had been standing in plain sight. The rumors did not move through official channels. They never did. They traveled through spaces where words were shared quietly and without record. At riverbanks where boats paused only briefly. At small churches where people lingered after services. In kitchens where hands worked while voices stayed low. Stories changed as they passed from mouth to mouth, but the center remained the same. A man had been hidden. A child had helped him. And for months, no one had noticed. On plantations nearby, overseers dismissed the talk as fantasy. Runaways were common. So were punishments. What was uncommon was survival. A wounded man could not last long without help. And help, in a place built on fear, was rare. Yet the timeline disturbed them. 9 months was not a small stretch of time. It was long enough for seasons to shift. Long enough for wounds to heal. Long enough for careful planning. And too long to be explained away as coincidence. The master of the plantation began to hear fragments of these rumors secondhand. Not from those beneath him, but from peers. Other landowners. Merchants. A man who had heard something at a river landing and laughed it off, until he realized how often the same story returned. At first, the master showed no reaction. His manner did not change. His routines remained intact. If anything, his attention to detail increased. Ledgers were reviewed more often. Work reports were double-checked. Small inconsistencies were noted where previously they might have been ignored. Order mattered to him. He believed chaos revealed weakness, and weakness invited loss. He had spent years cultivating the image of control, not just for those who worked under him, but for those who watched from a distance. A rumor left unanswered could grow. And growth, unchecked, threatened authority. Still, he hesitated. Accusations without proof were dangerous. Investigations created disruption. And disruption had a cost. He needed certainty before acting. Or at least something close to it. The overseer was instructed to observe rather than intervene. To listen rather than confront. To report anything unusual, no matter how small. For weeks, nothing surfaced. Children continued their routines. They worked, rested, and slept under watchful eyes. None showed obvious signs of defiance. None behaved as though they were carrying a secret. Most appeared exactly as they always had. That was part of what made the situation unsettling. Children were not known for restraint. Fear could silence them for a time, but months required discipline. Planning. An understanding of consequences. These were qualities adults struggled to maintain, let alone children raised under constant surveillance. And yet, something had clearly happened. The plantation house itself became a focus of attention. Its structure was old, expanded over decades rather than designed at once. Rooms had been added, sealed, repurposed. Closets led into narrow spaces. Staircases ended where walls had been built later. The house held more shadows than most. Servants moved through these spaces daily, cleaning, carrying, listening. They knew the rhythms of the house better than anyone. But even among them, nothing was openly said. Silence, when practiced long enough, becomes a skill. The wounded man, whoever he was, had not arrived quietly. That much was certain. Injuries leave marks. Pain slows movement. Survival would have required food, water, and care. Someone had taken risks. Someone had made choices knowing what discovery would mean. Those choices had not been made by accident. As spring turned into summer, the river rose. Boats moved more frequently. Outsiders passed through the region, bringing news from elsewhere. War talk drifted in from distant fronts. The world beyond the plantation felt closer, more unstable. With that instability came fear. The master noticed changes in himself. A restlessness. An irritation at small errors. A sense that something was unfolding beyond his control. He compensated by tightening rules, issuing reminders, and enforcing punishments more strictly than before. Discipline increased. So did resentment. It was during this period that the first physical sign appeared. Not proof, but a disruption. A locked door found unlatched. A storage space with signs of recent use. Footprints where none should have been. Each incident alone meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. The overseer reported these details cautiously. He chose his words carefully, aware that suspicion without evidence could reflect poorly on him. Still, the message was clear. Something was wrong. And it was close. The master ordered a quiet inspection of the house. No announcements were made. No sudden searches. The goal was to observe without alerting anyone who might be involved. Rooms were entered under the pretense of repairs. Closets were opened and closed. Walls were tapped. Floors examined for signs of disturbance. Days passed. Then, during what was meant to be a routine check, a door was found where none was expected. It was narrow, partly concealed, and rarely used. The kind of door that disappeared into familiarity. Most had walked past it for years without noticing. It had been assumed sealed, or simply forgotten. When it was opened, the space behind it was not empty. The discovery did not bring immediate answers. It brought questions layered upon questions. How long had the space been used? Who had known? Who had helped? And most unsettling of all, how many times authority had passed nearby without seeing what was directly in front of it. The truth, once uncovered, did not arrive cleanly. It came in fragments. In reactions that could not be controlled. In silence where there should have been denial. In faces that revealed more than words ever could. What followed would change the way the plantation was remembered. Though few would speak of it openly. Some stories survive not because they are written down, but because they refuse to disappear. And this one was no longer silent. The discovery did not spread immediately. That was deliberate. Panic created noise, and noise attracted attention. The master understood this well. Whatever had been found behind the concealed door needed to be contained before it became known. Those present were ordered to say nothing. Faces were studied closely. Reactions were memorized. Silence was enforced without explanation. Inside the hidden space, the signs were undeniable. Bedding that had been used and reused. Containers that once held food and water. Marks on the wall where someone had leaned repeatedly, either for support or rest. This was not a place of brief shelter. It was a place of survival. And survival required help. The question was no longer whether someone had been hidden. The question was who had made it possible. Supplies did not appear on their own. Doors did not unlock themselves. Children, especially, were not expected to coordinate silence for such a length of time. Yet the evidence pointed in that direction. Attention turned quietly toward the children listed in the old ledger. Their names were reviewed again, this time with a different lens. Ages reconsidered. Work assignments examined for irregularities. Moments of absence reinterpreted. Small details took on new meaning. A child assigned to housework had more freedom of movement. Another had regular access to food scraps. One had been excused from duties more often than others due to perceived weakness. Individually, these things meant little. Together, they suggested opportunity. Still, no accusation was made openly. Fear has a way of slowing decisions. Accusing the wrong person could fracture control. It could also expose how long authority had failed to notice what was happening within its own walls. The overseer was instructed to observe again, but this time more closely. To watch how the children interacted with one another. To note glances held too long. Silences that lingered. Sudden changes in behavior. Children sense danger before adults do. One of them began to withdraw. Another grew unusually quiet. A third reacted sharply when questioned, not with defiance, but with fear so immediate it raised suspicion. Fear was expected. But fear shaped by knowledge was different. Behind the scenes, the master reviewed his records late into the night. He searched for explanations that did not involve failure. Miscounts. Clerical errors. External interference. Anything that preserved the idea that order had been intact. But the longer he searched, the clearer it became that the system had not broken suddenly. It had been bypassed. Someone had learned its rhythms. Someone had exploited its blind spots. And that realization was deeply unsettling. Children were not supposed to understand systems of power. They were meant to exist beneath them. Yet what stood before him suggested that understanding had existed where it was least expected. The possibility angered him. Not simply because a man had escaped punishment, but because the escape challenged the hierarchy itself. It suggested that authority could be observed, studied, and quietly outmaneuvered. That idea was dangerous. Interrogations began carefully. Not formal. Not forceful. Questions were asked casually, during routine interactions. A remark here. An observation there. Each response was weighed. Most of the children said nothing unusual. Some said nothing at all. One, however, hesitated. It was brief. Almost imperceptible. But hesitation in a place ruled by fear stood out. The child corrected themselves too quickly, offering an answer that sounded rehearsed. That was enough. Pressure increased subtly. Work schedules were altered. Privileges removed. Sleep disrupted. The goal was not punishment, but exhaustion. People reveal more when they are tired. Still, days passed without a confession. The master grew impatient. What frustrated him most was not the secrecy, but the restraint. Whoever had orchestrated this had understood restraint remarkably well. No unnecessary risks had been taken. No patterns obvious enough to trigger suspicion earlier. The wounded man himself was never found. That fact alone suggested planning beyond impulse. Someone had known when to move him. When to hide him deeper. When to keep him still. Eventually, the silence broke. It did not come as a declaration. It came as collapse. A child, worn down by weeks of quiet pressure, failed to maintain control. Words came out tangled and incomplete. Names were mentioned, then retracted. Fear overpowered discipline. Once spoken, the truth could not be gathered back. The account that emerged was fragmented, but consistent. The man had arrived injured and near death. He had been found by chance. Helping him had not been discussed. It had simply happened. Food was brought in small amounts. Water shared quietly. Movements timed to moments when eyes were elsewhere. The children had not spoken of it, not even among themselves, except when necessary. They had understood, instinctively, that silence was the only protection they had. When the master heard this, he did not respond immediately. He dismissed everyone and returned to his records. The ledger lay open on the desk, its pages illuminated by candlelight. For the first time, the list of names no longer felt abstract. They were no longer entries. They were actors. What followed would not be handled with the urgency of rage, but with the calculation of preservation. The story, if it spread, could damage more than reputation. It could encourage imitation. It could weaken fear. That could not be allowed. So the response would be measured. Controlled. And, as much as possible, invisible. But control, once challenged, is never fully restored. And the plantation would soon learn that silence, once broken, leaves echoes that do not fade easily. Once the silence was broken, it could not be fully repaired. Even those who had not spoken now carried the weight of knowing. Knowledge changed posture. It altered the way people moved through familiar spaces. It revealed itself in small, uncontrollable ways. The master understood this immediately. He knew punishment alone would not erase what had happened. Pain could enforce obedience, but it could not restore ignorance. And ignorance, more than obedience, was the foundation of his authority. The children were separated. Not abruptly, and not publicly. Their routines were altered under practical excuses. One reassigned to the fields. Another sent farther from the house. A third placed under closer supervision. The goal was isolation. To prevent shared memory from becoming shared defiance. No announcement was made about the hidden man. Officially, nothing had occurred. The plantation records remained clean. No entry acknowledged discovery. No line admitted failure. But beneath the surface, everything shifted. Those who had participated in the concealment were watched constantly. Their movements tracked. Their interactions limited. They were not beaten immediately. That restraint was intentional. Sudden violence raised questions. Quiet control left fewer marks. The wounded man himself was never officially named. In private correspondence, he was referred to indirectly. A problem. An irregularity. A disruption. Language was chosen carefully, even in secrecy. Words had power, and the master avoided granting the man any more significance than necessary. What mattered was not the man, but what his survival represented. It suggested that the system could be exploited from within. That children, assumed to be passive, could become active participants in resistance. That fear, while effective, was not absolute. That idea unsettled more than the event itself. Beyond the plantation, the world was changing. News of war filtered through conversations that were never meant to be overheard. Troops moved along the river. Laws were debated far from the fields, but their consequences crept closer each day. The master sensed the instability. It made him cautious. Punishment carried risk now. Too much force, too visible, could invite scrutiny. Too little could invite repetition. He needed balance, and balance required patience. The children felt this shift, even if they could not name it. Rules tightened, but unpredictably. Some days passed quietly. Others brought sudden correction for minor mistakes. The uncertainty was deliberate. Predictability allowed preparation. Uncertainty exhausted resistance. Still, something had changed irreversibly. The children who had hidden the man no longer saw the plantation as all-seeing. They had learned that blind spots existed. That walls could conceal. That authority depended, at least in part, on belief. That knowledge could not be taken back. At night, the house seemed different. The corridors felt narrower. Doors once ignored now carried meaning. Even those uninvolved sensed tension, though they did not understand its source. Fear spread without explanation, filling the spaces where truth was denied. The master reviewed his legacy during this time. He thought not only of the present, but of how the future would remember him. Records mattered. Narratives mattered. What survived on paper often mattered more than what truly occurred. He adjusted accordingly. Certain documents were rewritten. Dates clarified. Ambiguous notes removed. The ledger that once listed the children was altered subtly. Names remained, but context was stripped away. Anyone reading it later would see nothing more than a routine entry. It was not the first time history had been shaped that way. The overseer, too, was warned. Loyalty was emphasized. Discretion rewarded. Failure implied consequences that did not need to be spoken aloud. He complied. Though uneasily. He had seen too much to believe fully in the illusion anymore. As weeks passed, attention slowly shifted outward. The immediate crisis faded into routine management. Crops demanded labor. Boats required coordination. Daily operations reclaimed focus. But memory lingered. Those involved carried it quietly. Not as hope, and not as triumph, but as proof. Proof that resistance did not always announce itself. That survival could be an act of defiance. That even within systems designed to erase humanity, choice still existed. The hidden space behind the door was sealed again. Furniture moved back into place. Dust settled. To anyone passing by, nothing appeared unusual. Yet the house was no longer the same. Neither were the people inside it. The truth had passed through those walls, and though it was buried once more, it left a trace. Not visible. Not recorded. But present. And time, slowly and without mercy, was moving closer to a moment when such truths would become harder to contain. As the months passed, the plantation settled into a strange version of normal. Work continued. Orders were given. Punishments were issued when necessary. On the surface, nothing appeared out of place. But beneath that surface, the memory of what had happened refused to fade. The children carried it quietly. They did not speak of the man they had hidden. They did not revisit the details, even in whispers. Silence had protected them once, and they understood its value now more than ever. What they shared was not conversation, but awareness. A look held too long. A pause before answering a question. An understanding that certain thoughts were never meant to be voiced. The master believed the matter contained. He told himself that control had been restored. That fear had resumed its proper function. Yet something unsettled him, especially in moments of stillness. He had ruled by predictability. People obeyed because they believed consequences were immediate and unavoidable. But the hidden man had proven otherwise. Consequences could be delayed. Authority could be evaded. And belief, once cracked, did not fully repair. He responded by tightening structure. Schedules became stricter. Movements were logged more carefully. Children were paired intentionally, watched not just individually, but in relation to one another. He studied patterns, convinced that resistance revealed itself through repetition. What he failed to understand was that the lesson learned by the children was adaptability. They had survived by being unremarkable. By blending into routine. By behaving exactly as expected. The same skill that allowed them to hide another human being now allowed them to hide themselves. Outside the plantation, the world continued to shift. Word of emancipation moved unevenly, arriving as rumor before law. Some spoke of freedom as an approaching certainty. Others dismissed it as distant fantasy. The uncertainty unsettled everyone. Including those who benefited most from delay. River traffic increased. Soldiers appeared more frequently. Conversations stopped abruptly when unfamiliar ears were nearby. Authority everywhere felt less solid, less eternal. The master sensed that time was no longer on his side. He thought often about the hidden man's fate. Not with guilt, but with irritation. Whether the man had survived beyond the plantation no longer mattered. What mattered was that his existence had created a fracture. One event had exposed a weakness that could not be unseen. That weakness was knowledge. Children were not supposed to know how power worked. They were meant to experience it, not analyze it. Yet these children had learned where power looked away. They had learned when attention shifted. They had learned that systems depended on habit. And habit could be interrupted. The master attempted to reclaim dominance through examples. Punishments became more symbolic. Designed not merely to hurt, but to remind. To demonstrate reach. To restore the feeling of inevitability. But fear delivered too deliberately loses its edge. Some responded with obedience. Others with withdrawal. And a few, quietly, with something else entirely. Not defiance, but patience. The kind of patience that waits rather than resists openly. The plantation house itself seemed to absorb the tension. Floors creaked louder at night. Doors closed more heavily. The sealed space behind the hidden door remained untouched, but its presence lingered in memory. A reminder that walls were not always what they appeared to be. Those who cleaned the house noticed subtle changes. Furniture rearranged unnecessarily. Objects moved and returned. As though someone was checking, again and again, that nothing remained concealed. Nothing did. And yet, the sense of exposure remained. The children grew older. Time passed, as it always does. Growth changed their roles. Some were assigned heavier labor. Others were relocated entirely. Separation continued, justified as routine management. But distance did not erase what had been shared. Shared experience creates its own form of record. Years later, when some of those children were no longer children at all, the memory still shaped them. Not as trauma alone, but as proof of capacity. Proof that even within systems designed to strip choice away, choice had been exercised. The master aged as well. His grip on daily operations loosened slightly. Oversight was delegated more often. Authority became less personal, more procedural. The system he had trusted outlived his direct control. And with that distance came vulnerability. The ledger, once so carefully maintained, was consulted less frequently. New hands copied old entries. Assumptions replaced vigilance. Small inconsistencies crept in, unnoticed at the time. The very attention that had once preserved control had begun to fade. What remained was the record. Incomplete. Altered. Selective. And hidden within that record was evidence of something the master had tried desperately to forget. Not written clearly. Not explained. But present enough for questions to form later, when the fear that once enforced silence no longer held the same power. History often waits for distance. Only when those who enforced silence are gone does the past begin to speak. And when it does, it rarely tells the story exactly as it was meant to be remembered. The truth does not rush. It lingers. And it was waiting. Time did what force could not. It loosened control without announcing itself. The routines remained, but the certainty behind them thinned. Authority continued to exist, yet it no longer felt absolute. It relied more on habit than fear, and habit is fragile. The children who had once been separated began to drift back into one another's awareness as years passed. Not intentionally. Not openly. But paths crossed. Assignments overlapped. Familiar faces reappeared in unexpected places. What they shared did not need to be spoken. They remembered. Each of them carried a private version of the same knowledge. That the plantation could be fooled. That watchfulness had limits. That silence, carefully maintained, could outlast power. The hidden man became less a person in their memories and more a symbol. Not of escape alone, but of possibility. Proof that the world was not entirely sealed. That cracks existed, even in structures designed to appear unbreakable. For the master, aging brought caution rather than reflection. He delegated responsibility while maintaining distance. Decisions were made through intermediaries. Orders delivered without explanation. The system functioned, but it lacked the sharpness it once had. Oversight became procedural. Ledgers were updated by others. Reports summarized rather than detailed. The attention that had once caught the smallest deviation now skimmed the surface. No one noticed the gaps forming, because no one expected to find them. Beyond the plantation, the river carried change steadily downstream. Laws shifted. Names were redefined. Categories once treated as permanent began to blur at the edges. Freedom arrived unevenly, inconsistently, and often without clarity. Some celebrated. Others resisted. Many simply waited. The plantation adjusted again, as it always had. Labor was reorganized. Language softened without changing intent. The appearance of order was preserved, even as its foundation weakened. Those who had lived through the months of silence watched carefully. They recognized patterns in transition. Moments when authority hesitated. When enforcement relied more on tradition than threat. These moments were subtle, but they mattered. The house itself aged along with its owner. Repairs were delayed. Sections closed off. Rooms repurposed or forgotten. The concealed space behind the door remained sealed, not because it was feared, but because it was no longer remembered clearly. Memory fades unevenly. Some things disappear quickly. Others linger, waiting for the right moment to return. The truth of what had happened was one of those things. It remained present without being acknowledged, like a pressure beneath the surface. Years later, after the plantation had changed hands, questions began to surface quietly. Not accusations. Not conclusions. Just questions. Why certain records were incomplete? Why certain names appeared without context? Why children were listed without explanation, then never mentioned again? No one alive could answer definitively. Those who had known chose silence long ago, and many carried it to the grave. Others remembered only fragments, distorted by time and necessity. Fear had shaped memory as much as fact. Historians approached the records cautiously. They learned quickly that absence often meant intention. That what was missing could be as revealing as what remained. They compared ledgers to letters. Logs to oral accounts. Patterns emerged slowly. The story that formed was incomplete, but unmistakable. Something had occurred that had not been meant to survive scrutiny. A disruption that had been contained, managed, and buried beneath routine. Children had played a role far greater than anyone had anticipated. An authority had been challenged without open confrontation. The plantation, once certain of its permanence, became a case study in fragility. Not because it fell suddenly, but because it had been undermined quietly, from within. The river continued its course, indifferent to legacy. It carried away the structures that once lined its banks. It eroded foundations, both physical and symbolic. What remained were traces. Photographs faded. Buildings decayed. Names survived unevenly. But the question persisted, unresolved and uncomfortable. How much of history is lost not because it was forgotten, but because it was intentionally silenced? And what happens when silence outlives those who enforced it? When the plantation finally passed out of private hands, it did so quietly. There was no ceremony. No acknowledgement of what had occurred within its walls. Ownership changed through paperwork, not reflection. The land remained. The river flowed on. And the house, though altered, still stood. Those who inherited it saw only a structure weathered by time. They repaired what was broken, repurposed what was outdated, and ignored what seemed unnecessary. The sealed space behind the forgotten door remained untouched, not out of caution, but out of ignorance. What people do not know, they do not fear. The records survived longer than the people who created them. Ledgers were boxed, moved, and eventually stored among countless others. To most eyes, they appeared ordinary. Lists of names. Dates. Transactions. Evidence of a system that had once been accepted as normal. But to those who knew how to read absence, something stood out. Children listed without explanation. Gaps where outcomes should have been recorded. Adjustments that felt intentional rather than accidental. The silence in the margins was deliberate, and it carried weight. Historians would later debate what could be proven and what could only be inferred. Some demanded certainty. Others argued that certainty was never the point. Systems built on domination rarely preserve evidence of their own vulnerability. What mattered was not a confession, but a pattern. A pattern that suggested resistance did not always arrive as rebellion. Sometimes it arrived as care. As quiet coordination. As the decision to protect another human being when protection carried unimaginable risk. The children were never publicly credited. Their names did not enter textbooks. Their actions were not commemorated. And yet, their choice altered the story in ways no ledger could fully erase. They proved that power was not absolute. That even in places designed to crush agency, agency survived. It adapted. It learned. It waited. The hidden man disappeared from the record entirely. Whether he lived or died beyond the plantation remains unknown. History offers no clear answer. But his presence, however brief, left an imprint deeper than any official acknowledgement ever could. He had been seen. He had been helped. And for 9 months, he had survived where survival was never intended. In the end, the story did not resolve with justice or closure. It resolved with recognition. Recognition that silence had been enforced, not accidental. That fear had been managed carefully. And that truth, when denied space, does not vanish. It embeds itself elsewhere. In memory. In pattern. In the quiet questions that surface generations later. The river carried these questions forward, just as it carried everything else. Along its banks, lives unfolded without knowing what had once been hidden nearby. Yet traces remained, layered beneath the present. History is not only what is written down. It is also what survives despite every effort to erase it. And sometimes, the most powerful acts are the ones that leave no official record at all. For more stories like this, subscribe to the channel.